Back in 2018, I did an episode about the little-remembered explosion aboard the USS Princeton in 1844. But in fact, there have been 6 USS Princetons to bear the name in the United States Navy's history, and more than one has fallen victim to explosive disaster. The mishaps aboard 3 very different USS Princetons deserve to be remembered. The now nearly forgotten explosion of the gun Peacemaker on the 29th of February, 1844, was what historian Kerry Walters described in his 2013 book Explosion on the Potomac as a black swan of the destructive variety. The huge naval gun's blown breach during demonstration killed 6 people, including the United States Secretary of State, Secretary of the Navy, and the Chief of the Navy's Bureau of Construction. Walters writes the explosion nearly cost the United States the state of Texas, put an end to John Tyler's chance of a second term in the White House, dangerously ratcheted up tensions between the North and South over slavery, and contributed to the eventual eruption of 2 wars. There are few events in the nation's history that have launched such a domino succession of unpredictable and disastrous or near-disastrous consequences. Among the victims, however, was the ship, USS Princeton, launched in 1843 and designed by John Erickson, a pioneering genius of naval engineering. The ship was groundbreaking in a number of ways, including the 2 vibrating lever engines designed by Erickson, whose design not only allowed them to sit below water level to protect them from damage, but also allowed extraordinary speed that allowed Princeton to easily outpace the famous British steamship Great Western in a speed trial. The New York Herald wrote that this certainly was a splendid trial for the Princeton, proving yourself equal and superior to the Western, whose prowess is so well known. Naval officer Harry Watts noted in the Naval Institute Press that each power plant weighed 85 tons and had been designed to turn Ericsson's screw. HMS Arrogant, built 5 years later, contained a steam system of comparable power, but at much greater weight, and its volume of some 2,800 cubic feet far exceeded the 1,700 cubic feet occupied by the Princeton's engine. Her unique power plant, using a collapsible funnel, filled New Yorkers watching her pass, the New York Herald wrote, with utter astonishment and amazement. And as a warship, her captain, Robert Stockton, told the Secretary of the Navy, "She can throw a greater weight of metal at one broadside than most frigates. The big guns of Princeton can be fired with an effect terrific and almost incredible, and with a certainty heretofore unknown." Princeton, the first screw steamship of the United States Navy, was, in brief, a ship of cutting-edge design, a leap forward for an otherwise backward U.S. Navy, a vessel the match of any at sea at the time. Naval historian Lee Pearson described Princeton. She could be called epic-making for many of her features, anticipated later practice. But after the explosion, the ship's reputation was tarnished, and her promising design nearly forgotten. Walters argues that the explosion delayed the modernization of the Navy by some 15 years, until Ericsson's skills were demanded again with the outbreak of the U.S. Civil War, when many of Princeton's unique features would be incorporated into his game-changing design of USS Monitor. Princeton was decommissioned in 1849, although some of her usable timbers were incorporated into another USS Princeton, commissioned in 1851. The 4th USS Princeton actually began as USS Tallahassee, a Cleveland-class light cruiser. But after Pearl Harbor, when it became clear that aircraft carriers would be vital, but that the Essex-class fleet carriers that had been ordered would not start to become available until 1944, FDR made the decision to convert several light cruisers, then under construction, into aircraft carriers. The Navy had concerns with the design, but the need to get carriers to sea won out, and the Independence class of light carriers was born. Tallahassee, still under construction, was renamed USS Princeton in March of 1942, launched in October and commissioned in February 1943, only the second of the class of eventually 9 ships to enter service behind USS Independence. 622 feet long with a beam of 71.5 feet, the ships of the Independence class performed better than the Navy expected and brought much-needed carrier support in the Pacific. Princeton saw significant service with her air group, starting with a simulated attack on Oahu, along with planes from USS Lexington and USS Belleau Wood, to test air defenses there. Planes from Princeton attacked enemy positions across the Pacific in support of the Pacific Campaign, in notable battles such as the invasion of Tarawa, Kwajalein Atoll, and Inawetick, as well as participating in the daring attacks on the Japanese base at Rabaul in November of 1943. The U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command notes that Princeton marked the anniversary of her commissioning by recording that she had steamed 70,701 miles during the first year of service and launched 44 airstrikes that dropped 44,000 pounds of bombs and torpedoes on the enemy. On October 24, 1944, the veteran USS Princeton was supporting Allied landings at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, part of Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 38. The U.S. Naval Institute Press writes, on the 24th, Task Group 38.3 was the northernmost of Mitcher's 4 task groups, steaming about 100 miles east of central Luzon, with its aircraft performing important reconnaissance duties. Aviator James Shirley of the Combat Air Group VF-27 would later recall to a friend, October 24, 1944 was the longest day of my life. Squadron VF-27, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Wood, had a particular distinction, having painted a cat's mouth on their Grumman F-4F Hellcats prior to deploying on the Princeton. While common in the Army Air Force, such details were against Navy regulations, but no one seems to have objected aboard Princeton. The website Wings Aviation describes their cruise aboard Princeton as, "This would prove to be one of the most spectacular light carrier cruises of the war." The squadron had seen significant action in their 6 months aboard Princeton, but October 24th would prove the most exciting day of all. In the morning, 20 Hellcats of VF-27 encountered a large formation of enemy aircraft. The Naval History and Heritage Command writes, in a wide-ranging action that included intercepts of enemy bombers and fighters, the VF-27 planes were credited with shooting down 36 enemy aircraft against the loss of just one of their squadron mates. Shirley was credited with 5 of those kills. The website HistoryNet writes, pilots became aces in a matter of minutes, earning him the Navy Cross. But as his plane was being refueled and rearmed, tragedy struck the Princeton. The Naval Institute Press writes, one of the intruders, a D-4Y Judy dive bomber that went undetected, broke out of the clouds above the Princeton, dropping 2 bombs at 09:39 hours and scoring 1 hit. HistoryNet explains the plane immediately came under fire from the forward 20mm and 40mm batteries, and the helm was put over to port in an evasion attempt. The Judy dropped 2 bombs. One missed Princeton and fell harmlessly into the sea. The other 550-pound bomb fell almost in the center of Princeton's deck, causing jarring on the bridge and a dull thud in the central station. The Naval History and Heritage Command writes that the bomb penetrated the flight deck and hangar bay before exploding beneath a number of fully armed and fueled TBM Avengers. With fuel pouring out of them, a violent fire erupted, filling the ship with thick clouds of smoke. 30 years later, Shirley wrote, I am now sitting here in my home, writing for the first time about these events. Yet I can, just as if they were happening while I sit here, taste the dryness in my mouth after aerial combat, see the arc of the Japanese plane as he went into his dive, and see the bomb separate from the plane on its way towards us. Hear the explosion of the series of blasts. Fueled by the aviation fuel, fires burned out of control. HistoryNet writes that less than 10 minutes after the bomb was dropped, the firefighting sprinkler system was completely disabled. Within the same short time span, the main engines lost almost all power, which first slowed Princeton and then brought her to a halt and turned her into a drifting, burning hulk. Princeton's captain, William H. Buracker, ordered the crew to abandon ship, leaving just 50 officers and men aboard to fight the fires. Shirley went over the side, wearing his Mae West life vest, but by the time he reached the destroyer, USS Irwin, he was too exhausted to climb the rescue ladder. The commander of Task Group 34.3, Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, ordered several ships to screen for additional aircraft, while the light cruiser USS Birmingham, like Princeton had originally been destined to be a Cleveland-class light cruiser, was ordered to come alongside Princeton and aid in fighting the fires, along with the destroyers USS Irwin and Cass and Young. Thomas B. Ingalls, captain of the Birmingham, ordered his crew to lead out all the fire hoses, put full pressure on the fire mains, and make every preparation for fighting the fires on the Princeton as effectively as possible. Fires raged aboard Princeton from the bridge all the way aft, while explosions of ordnance and ammunition, small and large, were nearly continuous. The 2 ships were colliding in the swells. Harry Poppin, a sailor aboard Birmingham, recalled, the carrier and cruiser smashed into each other in the incessant swells. It was sickening to watch. It seemed as though the 2 ships were attempting to destroy each other. But slowly the efforts were paying off, and the fires pushed back. However, the Naval Institute Press writes, just as it looked like the salvage effort was succeeding, an air attack and possible submarine contact were reported in the vicinity. Birmingham had to back off to be able to maneuver. The air attack was defeated, and the submarine contact proved to be false. Still assuming the chances of saving Princeton were high, Irwin moved Birmingham close again to fight the remaining fires. Popham recalled, Princeton appeared to be serenely drifting with the current. It appears as if the fires had gone out on their own. Our little group on Birmingham figured the excitement was over. The fires aboard Princeton had been extinguished. But as the ships came within 50 feet, to his horror, he saw a flame leap inside Princeton towards a row of bombs. He recalled, all hell broke loose with an enormous eruption. 130 feet of Princeton's stern blew off, as well as 180 feet of her flight deck. Birmingham's damage report read, a veritable rain of debris fell upon the ship, ranging in size from microscopic pieces of shrapnel to large sections of plating, including such items as 40-millimeter barrels, dress blues, life jackets, gas masks, steel helmets, beams from flight deck, chunks of rock and cement, tool chests, pieces of machinery, CO2 bottles, 40-millimeter and 20-millimeter powder grains, armatures, etc. For several seconds, the air was filled with such debris. Fortunately, several huge pieces of ship, declared by some observers to have been the size of a house, missed the Birmingham. Popham was later quoted in World War II magazine. I am probably one of only 2 living eyewitnesses to a tragic event. Except for a buddy and me, everyone who had been in a position to see the start of the explosion that eventually sank Princeton was killed outright that day. Princeton could not be saved. The remaining crew aboard were evacuated and the burning carrier sunk by USS Reno. Despite the disaster, casualties aboard Princeton were relatively light. Of 1,361 crew, 108 were lost. Casualties were higher aboard Birmingham, whose decks had been crowded with men when the explosion occurred. 241 men of Birmingham had died and 412 wounded, nearly half the ship's complement. Birmingham received a Navy unit commendation for the action. The 4th USS Princeton had received 9 battle stars before being lost. A new Essex-class fleet carrier was commissioned in November 1945, becoming the 5th USS Princeton and serving through the Korean conflict, decommissioned in 1970. The 6th USS Princeton is a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, laid down in 1986 and commissioned in February 1989. The 567-foot Ticonderoga class are multi-role warships, mounting the formidable Aegis combat system and numerous types of missiles. In 1991, the ship was sent to the Persian Gulf as part of Operation Desert Storm. Jerry Dickerson, an officer aboard Princeton, wrote on the webpage a story worth telling. Our ship was one of the latest of the Ticonderoga-class Aegis cruisers at the time and was assigned to the air warfare commander role in the northern Persian Gulf in support of the pending ground war with Iraq. The ship's captain, E.B. Hauntz, told the Naval Institute Press, our job at the time was to provide protection for the minesweeping and naval gunfire support forces against any kind of air threat. On February 18th, Princeton was in the northern Gulf, moving to be able to intercept any anti-ship missiles which might threaten the fleet, when the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli struck a contact mine, which tore a 16 to 20-foot hole in the ship's hull. Tripoli was still dealing with the damage, and Hauntz told the crew of Princeton that we have to be especially cautious and be on the lookout for mines, because USS Tripoli had hit a mine just hours earlier. Just as I made that comment, he recalled, the forces of the mine explosion under the stern lifted up the ship and caused a whiplash. The ship had struck a bottom-mounted influence mine. Dickerson was officer of the deck at the time. He recalled, the closer mine was off our port quarter. As we pivoted our stern in the direction of that particular mine, the pressure wave caused by our propeller detonated that mine and began to lift our stern out of the water. That mine set off a second mine off our starboard bow, sympathetically, and caused us to rock vigorously back in the other direction. Hauntz said we on the bridge were moving up and down very rapidly. We all grabbed onto something and tried to maintain our footing. We were doing some pretty healthy knee bends as the ship moved up and down, perhaps 4 to 6 feet. After cycles of moving up and down, we started moving sideways. The Naval Institute Press notes that the Princeton was nearly dead in the water, with her fantail almost ripped from her hull. The explosions had jammed the port rudder and the starboard propeller shaft. Hauntz wrote, we assessed damage from frame 472 forward. In several areas there was significant damage to the hull where plates had buckled. Most concerningly, Dickerson wrote that the combined trauma to the ship severely damaged the stern of our ship and one of the propeller shafts, thereby making us dead in the water. Additionally, several pipes internal to the ship burst, and we eventually had to secure air conditioning, which meant a temporary shutdown of our air defense radars and thus missile systems. In sum, we became a big metal sitting target and extraordinarily vulnerable to missile attack. Immediately there were injury reports. Hauntz wrote that anyone who was in the bow or stem was thrown around like a rag doll. as 3 men were injured, 1 seriously. A salvage ship, USS Beaufort, was dispatched, aided by a minesweeper, USS Adroit, but the crew began damage control. Dickerson writes, "Through the valiant reaction of a well-trained crew on damage control, the ship's air conditioning and thus defense systems were restored, were able to resume air warfare commander role. Repairs were enough to let the ship get underway, but Hans was concerned that they might drift into another mine and had Beaufort take them under tow. They were led from the minefield by the 35-year-old minesweeper. The Naval Institute Press writes, the USS Adroit, an old wooden-hulled minesweeper left behind in the wake of a modern navy and nearly forgotten, proved her worth during the Gulf War. Captain Huntz told the Naval Institute Press, all of us in the Princeton owe a big debt to the officers and men of both the Beaufort and the Adroit. They are real pros. USS Princeton was the most damaged U.S. warship of the Gulf War, requiring 8 weeks of repairs in Kuwait before being able to return to the United States. But despite the damage, the Naval Institute Press notes, the ship continued during her duty, continued to defend the fleet as the air warfare commander for 30 hours before the ship could be relieved by another cruiser. USS Princeton is still at sea, one of 11 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers still in active service. The explosions that damaged 3 very different USS Princetons were not just representative of the challenges of their times, but of the dangers faced by sailors at sea. And the sailors who fight hard to save their ships in times of distress deserve to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.